of shattering crystal cut through the entire 43rd floor of the Beaumont Tower, but the scream that followed didn't belong to the woman who deserved to scream. It belonged to Brynn Calloway, and she was bleeding. Nobody at the Hargrove Gala that night would have noticed Brynn Calloway if she hadn't been standing directly in the path of disaster. That was, in a way, the whole point of her. At 26, Brynn was the kind of woman that expensive rooms were not designed for. She stood 5'4" and carried somewhere between 260 and 280 pounds, depending on the week and how many double shifts she'd pulled at the hotel. Black server's uniform she wore strained across her broad back. The stiff collar left red marks on her thick neck by the end of every shift. Her dark auburn hair was pinned into a bun so tight it gave her a headache, and her sensible flat shoes, the only real mercy in her wardrobe, had been soaked through from a kitchen spill before the gala had even officially started. Was invisible. She had spent 26 years learning how to be. The Hargrove was Montreal's most exclusive private club, a place where old money met new ruthlessness in a building that smelled permanently of cedar, cognac, and quiet power. Living staff floated through the crowd without eye contact, without names, without opinions. Brynn was good at all three. She was careful. She was quick. She kept her tray level even when her arms ached, and she never, under any circumstances, made the guests uncomfortable by existing too loudly. She had been working banquet service at the Hargrove for 3 years, not because she loved it, but because her mother's MS medication cost $4,000 a month, and the Hargrove paid in cash tips that the government didn't need to know about. Her younger brother, Callum, was in his 2nd year of electrical apprenticeship and living on her couch. He had a savings account with $1,100 in it, and a plan, fragile as tissue paper, to eventually do something better with the culinary diploma she'd earned at 22 and hadn't touched since. But right now she was carrying a tray of champagne through a room full of the most dangerous people in Eastern Canada. Knew, the way anyone in service work eventually learns, that the Hargrove Gala was not simply a charity fundraiser for children's literacy. It was dressed up as one. The silent auction featured signed hockey jerseys and weekend packages to Whistler. The centerpieces were white roses and eucalyptus, $40 a stem. Guest list read like a who's who of Montreal's finance and real estate world, which was, if you asked anyone willing to speak honestly, a fairly accurate map of organized crime in the province of Quebec. The center of it all was Constantin Marot. Constantin was 51. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once in a sharp, angular way, and had since settled into something more commanding than handsome. His hair was silver at the temples and iron grey. Everywhere else he was not tall, but he carried himself with the deliberate stillness of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made specifically for his body in a workshop in Milan that did not accept walk-in appointments. He smiled sparingly, and only when it meant something, and his dark eyes moved through every room he entered with the unhurried precision of a man cataloguing exits. Indian. Constantin Marot controlled the shipping infrastructure of the St. Lawrence Corridor. He controlled 3 members of the provincial legislature, 2 federal backbenchers, and a judge in the Court of Appeal. Legitimate holdings, a real estate development company, a chain of boutique hotels, and a stake in 2 mid-size manufacturing firms were worth somewhere north of $400 million. His illegitimate holdings were worth considerably more, and were nobody's business but his own. He had been widowed for 6 years. He did not, as far as Brynn could tell from 3 years of working his events, appear to grieve publicly, or date publicly, or do anything publicly that suggested he was a human being with personal feelings rather than a very sophisticated and vaguely menacing machine. Knew the one exception was his mother. Marguerite Marot was 74 years old. She had been a school teacher in Verdun for 30 years before her retirement. She was small and bird-like, with white hair swept up into a chignon and a string of real pearls she had worn at every Hargrove event Brynn had ever seen her attend. She spoke with a soft Quebecois accent and always thanked the serving staff by name, which meant she was the only guest who had ever learned Brynn's name at all. Het had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia 2 years prior. Most of the guests didn't know. Most of Constantine's associates didn't know. The official line was that Marguerite had simply become more private in her older age, more selective about her engagements. But Brynn knew, in the way that people who are genuinely invisible always end up knowing things, because she had found Marguerite twice in the wrong hallway, staring at a fire exit, with confused, frightened eyes. And she had both times gently, quietly taken the older woman by the arm and talked her back to her seat, as though nothing had happened at all. Yet, Marguerite had squeezed her hand the second time and said very softly in French that she reminded her of her own daughter who had moved to Vancouver and didn't call enough. Brynn had smiled and said nothing. She'd thought about it for weeks afterward. Gala reached its most precarious moment at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. Brynn was navigating the edge of the main floor, trying to deliver a fresh round of drinks to the east side tables, when she spotted the woman near the bar, Isabeau Fontaine, Constantine's date for the evening, though date was perhaps too mild a word. Isabeau was the daughter of Gerard Fontaine, who ran the Fontaine family's interests in Ontario and had been angling for a formal alliance with the Marrow network for the better part of 2 years. Isabeau was 29, thin in the particular way that reads as expensive, and possessed of the kind of beauty that had probably never once failed to open a door for her. It was also, Brynn had noticed over the course of the evening, systematically cruel in the way that people are when they are entirely confident no one important is watching. He had snapped at the coat check attendant. She had sent back a glass of still water because it wasn't cold enough. She had made a pointed comment about the floral arrangements to the event coordinator in a voice just loud enough for the coordinator to hear, while being just quiet enough to offer plausible deniability. She was, in short, the kind of person who treated invisible people as furniture and furniture as an inconvenience. Brynn had given her a wide berth all evening, gave her less of one than she intended when she rounded the corner near the dessert station, and a passing guest's elbow caught the back of her tray. The tray tilted. Not catastrophically, not enough to spill, but enough to make Brynn stagger sideways, her hip catching the edge of Isabeau's clutch bag and sending it skidding across the marble floor. Isabeau turned. The look she leveled at Brynn was the kind that strips the skin. Honestly, Isabeau said, not loudly, but with perfect surgical precision, picking up her clutch and looking at Brynn the way someone looks at a stain on a carpet. Do they just hire anyone here? Are there no requirements at all? Men nearby chuckled softly. One of them looked away. Brynn's face went hot from the jaw up. I'm very sorry, Miss Fontaine, she said, because that was what you said. It won't happen again. No, Isabeau agreed, her eyes traveling up and down Brynn's uniform with undisguised contempt. I imagine running into things is rather a specialty of yours. Brynn turned and walked away. She was good at walking away. She had a lot of practice. She was halfway to the service corridor when she realized Marguerite Marot was not at her table. Chair at the head table was empty. The napkin was still folded. The champagne glass was untouched. Marguerite had been there 20 minutes ago. Brynn was certain of it, because she had personally delivered a cup of chamomile tea without being asked, and the older woman had looked up with such genuine gratitude that it had made the entire night worth showing up for. The ballroom was too loud, the lights were too bright. The photographers kept firing their flashes in unpredictable bursts. Brynn knew what those conditions did to Marguerite. She set her tray on the service station and slipped into the east hallway. Checked the small lounge near the elevators. Empty. She checked the powder room corridor. Empty. She moved deeper into the east wing, past the framed photographs of the Hargroves' various distinguished patrons over the decades, past the room where the auction items were laid out under glass, and toward the narrow reading room at the very end of the hall that most guests didn't know existed because it wasn't on any map of the club. And you had to know to look for it. The door was cracked open. Light came through in a thin line. Brynn heard Marguerite's voice first, thin and wavering, the voice of someone trying to hold on to something that kept sliding away. And she heard Isabeau Fontaine's. "Nyan. You need to understand something," Isabeau was saying in the particular flat tone of someone who has decided that niceties are a waste of time. "Once Constantin and I formalize our arrangement, your involvement in his decisions ends. That's not a threat, it's just practical. You're not well. Everybody knows it, even if nobody says it. He needs a partner who can actually function in his world, not a liability he has to babysit." "Contan wouldn't," Marguerite began. "Yeah, Constantin will do what's best for his future," Isabeau said, "which does not include managing a mother with dementia at every public function. There are facilities that handle this, good ones, discreet ones. You'd be comfortable." Brynn stood very still in the hallway. Her hand was flat against the wall. "Go. I want to go back," Marguerite said softly, and her voice had the fractured quality that Brynn had come to recognize, the quality of someone no longer entirely sure where back was. "I want to find my son." "A moment," Isabeau said, and the patience in her voice was the worst kind, the patience of someone managing an obstacle. "First, I need you to understand that this evening is very important to me, and I need you to stay out of my way. Can you do that? Can you just stay out of the way for one night?" And Marguerite made a small, frightened sound. Brynn pushed the door open. Both women turned. Isabeau's expression shifted in a fraction of a second from cold authority to social performance. Marguerite looked at Brynn with the wide, lost eyes of someone who had just been thrown a rope. "There you are," Brynn said very calmly, directing all of her attention to Marguerite. "I've been looking for you. Mr. Marot was asking for you. He wanted to introduce you to the mayor before the speeches." She smiled. "Shall I walk you back?" Marguerite reached for Brynn's arm immediately, both hands gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "Yes," the older woman breathed. "Yes, please." Isabeau took a single step forward. She and I were in the middle of a conversation. "Of course," Brynn said pleasantly, already turning Marguerite toward the door. "I'm sure there'll be time to continue later." Isabeau moved faster than Brynn expected. She stepped directly into their path, and when Marguerite flinched backward, her elbow caught the edge of the reading table. The antique lamp on it wobbled and tipped. Marguerite reached out instinctively to catch it, her frail hand flailing wide. Isabeau pulled back sharply, her face twisting with pure, startled fury. The ring on her right hand, a wide oval setting of hammered gold with a large central stone surrounded by raised metal claws, had been struck by Marguerite's glancing hand. The ring had twisted, the stone was loose. Isabeau looked down at it with the expression of someone who has just watched several $1,000s of jewelry become potentially irreparable. She raised her hand. It was not a controlled gesture. It was not the restrained cruelty of someone concerned with appearances. It was the unmediated rage of someone who had never once in their life been told that they could not do a thing. And she swung at Marguerite. Brynn stepped in front of her. Did not think. There was no moment of deliberation, no weighing of consequences, no small internal voice cataloguing the professional and personal risks of physically inserting herself between a mob boss's date and his elderly mother in the private reading room of the most exclusive club in Montreal. Her body simply moved, the way bodies move when they have already decided something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. The ring caught Brynn above the cheekbone. The was extraordinary. Not the sharp, bright pain of a slap, but something deeper, tearing the metal catching and dragging across her cheek as Isabeau's momentum carried through. Brynn felt the warmth of blood before she felt the full extent of the injury. She staggered, Her shoulder hit the wall, slid down it slowly, ending up seated on the reading room floor, with her back against the wainscoting, and Marguerite crouching beside her, with both small hands pressed to Brynn's face, repeating her name in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away. Brynn, ma chérie, someone help her please. She heard Isabeau say something sharp and defensive. She heard the door open wider. She heard footsteps, not the soft carpet-muffled steps of a server, but the deliberate, unhurried sound of someone who moved at exactly the pace they chose, and not one step faster. What happened in here? It was not a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was a statement with a gap in it, a gap that someone was going to fill, whether they chose to or not. Constantin Marot stood in the doorway. He was flanked by two men. They were the kind of men whose suit jackets fit oddly across the shoulders for reasons that had nothing to do with tailoring. They stood exactly 1/2 step behind Constantin and did not move, breathe loudly, or look at anything other than the room. Constantin's eyes moved through the reading room the way they always did, cataloguing, assessing, arriving at conclusions before most people had finished forming questions. They landed on his mother. First, then on the blood, then on Brynn, sitting on the floor, her white service shirt already red at the collar. Then, last and most briefly, on Isabeau. Constantin. Isabeau's voice was controlled again, fast and smooth, already building its architecture. Your mother became confused and agitated. She knocked over the lamp, and this woman charged into the room. Constantin raised one finger. It was not pointed at anyone. It didn't need to be. Isabeau stopped, crossed the room, and crouched beside his mother, speaking to her in low, rapid French, checking her hands, her face, her arms. Marguerite gripped his sleeve and spoke in a tumble of words, some of them coherent, some of them not. He listened to all of them with equal patience. Then he turned to Brynn. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular quality of stillness that was not calm so much as absolute control. "You're Brynn," he said. "My mother talks about you." Brynn blinked. Her face was throbbing. "She does. Says you're the only one who looks for her when she wanders." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded handkerchief, white linen, initialed. He pressed it gently to the cut on her cheek, and she winced. "Hold that there. Don't move." Stood up. He did not look at Isabeau with anger. He looked at her with something considerably more frightening, with the complete and total absence of any feeling whatsoever. "Engagement," he said, "is over." For the words were so quiet that Brynn almost missed them under the buzzing in her ears. Isabeau stared at him. "You cannot be serious, my father." "Null will be contacted tonight." Constantin adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve. "Your family's proposal has been declined. You'll be escorted out through the service entrance in the interest of discretion. I'd recommend accepting that offer." "Over a server?" Isabeau's voice cracked, disbelief fracturing the control she'd rebuilt. "Over a fat, clumsy server who had no business being in this room?" "Over my mother," Constantin said, "and over a woman who bled on my floor to protect her." He looked at the men in the doorway. "Take Miss Fontaine to her car. Stay with her until she's gone." He turned back to Brynn without waiting to watch Isabeau leave. He crouched beside her again, his dark eyes level with hers. "You stand." "So." She tried. Her legs were unsteady. He put a hand under her elbow, and the grip was firm but careful, the grip of someone accustomed to managing fragile things without breaking them. Position, on call for the club, private, discreet. He looked at the handkerchief, now soaked through. "That laceration needs sutures. Come." Wanted to say she was fine. She wanted to say she'd see the walk-in clinic after her shift, that it was nothing, that he shouldn't trouble himself. 26 years of making herself smaller in expensive rooms had built up a very elaborate script for exactly this kind of moment. Didn't say any of it. 'Cause Marguerite had taken hold of her free hand and was walking beside her and murmuring something soft and continuous in French, and for reasons Brynn couldn't entirely account for, she wasn't willing to let go. Dr. Fontecourt arrived within 12 minutes and worked in a small private room off the main corridor with the efficiency of someone who had seen far worse and asked far fewer questions than most doctors felt compelled to. He sutured the cut, 4 stitches on the deepest part of the laceration, cleaned the surrounding tissue, and was checking his work under a light when he paused. He set down his instrument. He looked at Brynn's face with an expression that had shifted from clinical to something more careful. "Moreau," he said, without turning around. Constantin was standing near the door. He had not left. "Yes." "I need you to look at something." He came to stand beside the physician. Dr. Fontecourt pointed to the area around the suture line, to the tissue that had swollen dramatically in the minutes since Brynn had been seated, to the faint but distinct discoloration spreading from the wound outward in a pattern that did not match a blunt force impact. "The ring," the doctor said. "Do you know what stone it had?" "Don't." Constantin looked at Brynn. She had not noticed. She had been focused entirely on keeping still for the suturing, but her fingers had gone numb. Her vision was pulling at the edges. A strange, slow heat was moving up the right side of her face and into her jaw. Dr. Fontecourt was already at his bag. "She's presenting with early neurotoxic symptoms. Local tissue reaction, vascular disruption, the beginnings of systemic absorption." He worked quickly, hands certain, the ring setting those raised claws around the stone. If the stone itself was a delivery mechanism, a reservoir of some kind, the impact would have... "It would have opened the wound," Constantin said, "and deposited directly into the bloodstream." The doctor drew a syringe. "I'm administering a broad-spectrum antitoxin, but we need to know what compound we're dealing with." Constantin had his phone in his hand. He stepped away from Brynn and spoke quietly, concisely, for approximately 90 seconds. When he came back, there was a new quality to his stillness, something that had settled deeper and colder, and was no longer merely composure. And he had understood something. Brynn saw it in his face before she understood it herself. She was fuzzy with the spreading toxin and the low thrum of pain, but she was not yet entirely unmoored, and she could read in the controlled flatness of Constantin Moreau's expression that the thing she had stumbled into was considerably larger than a jealous woman's temper. The Fontaine proposal had never been a marriage negotiation. Gerard Fontaine had wanted the Moreau network absorbed into his own operation, not through a deal but through a succession, a widowerhood, a grieving family in disarray. Isabeau's ring had been the instrument, the plan as Constantin pieced it together over the next hour, from information that arrived in quick, clipped messages on his encrypted phone, had been to introduce the compound during an intimate moment and ensure that Constantin Moreau died of what would appear to be a sudden cardiac event within 48 hours of the gala. Brynn Calloway, in stumbling between Isabeau Fontaine and a frightened elderly woman, had absorbed a dose intended to work its way through Constantin's bloodstream before anyone thought to question the cause of death. Knew this by 11:15. By midnight, the Fontaine family's warehousing operations in Laval and Longueuil were being walked through by men who had been waiting for a reason. By 2 in the morning, the 6 members of the provincial legislature who had taken Fontaine money were receiving phone calls that would, it was made clear, determine the remainder of their careers. By 4, Gerard Fontaine himself was sitting in a room he did not recognize, speaking to men he could not identify, understanding for the first time in 3 decades of criminal enterprise what it felt like to be the one without any options. Constantin did not sleep. He sat in the hospital corridor outside the room where Dr. Fontecourt worked to neutralize the compound in Brynn's bloodstream, and he sat there the way he did everything, without fidgeting, without complaint, with his hands folded and his face unreadable. His mother slept in the chair beside him, her silver head on his shoulder, her breathing slow and even. At 5:40 in the morning, Dr. Fontecourt came out and said the antitoxin had worked. The compound was neutralized, and she would recover completely. Constantin said, "Thank you," in the quiet, precise way he said everything. He sat back down and did not move until the winter light started coming in through the east-facing windows. When Brynn woke, the room was full of pale January sun and the smell of real coffee, which was disorienting because hospital coffee did not smell like that. She turned her head carefully, aware of the bandaging on her cheek, and found a tray on the bedside table with a proper ceramic cup and a small covered plate. The tray was a chair, and in the chair was Constantin Marot, reading something on his phone with the composed, impenetrable focus of a man who had simply decided he would be somewhere and had no particular need to justify it. Looked up when she moved. "Do you feel?" he said. Again, not quite a question. The habit of a man to whom the world generally answered. "Strange," she said honestly. "Grateful. Confused about the coffee." "It's from the kitchen downstairs. The hospital coffee is a crime." He set down his phone. "Dr. Fontecourt says there's no lasting damage. You'll have a scar. He's recommended a cosmetic surgeon, but that's your decision." "It's okay." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, working through the sequence of the previous night, in the slightly dislocated way of someone reconstructing events through medication and sleep. "Is your mother all right?" "Slept well. She's at home now." A pause. "She asked me to thank you. She also asked me to tell you that you looked like you needed a proper sleep, and she was right." Brynn almost smiled. The movement pulled at her cheek. "She's been asking about you for 2 years, Constantin said. She describes you as the only person in that building who has ever treated her as though she were a person rather than a problem to be managed." He looked at his hands briefly. "She's right about that too. Easy to be kind too. Not everyone finds it easy." Brynn didn't answer that. It seemed like a statement that wanted to be left alone. Constantin reached into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope, plain white, unsealed, and set it on the tray beside the coffee. "Your position at the Hargrove has been made permanent, with a significant salary adjustment if you want it. Your mother's medication costs will be covered for the foreseeable future through a private health trust." That's not conditional on anything. It is not a trade. "What you did last night was not a transaction." He paused. "Your brother, I'm told, is completing an apprenticeship. There's a project beginning in the spring that will need qualified electricians. If he's interested, the work will be there." Brynn stared at him. "You looked into my family?" "I looked into you," he said without apology. "After what happened, I wanted to understand who you were." And the briefest pause. "I found that you have been quietly holding 3 people together for a very long time," he said, "without any of the scaffolding that makes that kind of thing easier. Without complaint, without anyone particularly noticing." He met her eyes. "I noticed." She didn't cry. She came close. She took a long breath instead, and then she picked up the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands, and she held the cup and let the warmth of it settle into her palms while she worked out what she was feeling. She was feeling more than anything seen, which was an entirely foreign sensation at 7 in the morning in a private hospital room in Montreal, sitting across from a man who had orchestrated the financial and political destruction of an organized crime family between midnight and dawn, and was now watching her drink coffee with the patient, attentive quality of someone who was not going anywhere. "Take the job," she said finally. "Good. And the trust for my mother. Thank you." "Yes." Looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Are you going to keep sitting there?" Constantin considered this with apparent seriousness. "For a while," he said, "unless you'd rather I didn't." Brynn thought about the last 3 years. She thought about the invisible life she'd built around the edges of other people's important evenings. She thought about Marguerite's hands, cold and desperate, gripping her wrist in a hallway outside a reading room. She thought about the moment she had stepped in front of a swinging arm and simply taken what came, because there had been no other version of herself that was possible in that moment. Thought about what it had felt like, afterward, to have someone look at her and say, simply, "I noticed." "No," she said, "stay." "Ye." Outside the window, Montreal was waking up. The St. Lawrence lay grey and patient below the city. Constantin reached for his phone and set it face down on the windowsill, which she somehow understood was an unusual thing for him to do, and they sat together in the thin winter light while the coffee cooled and the city moved, and somewhere across the river, the remaining architecture of the Fontaine family's ambitions finished collapsing into dust. Human, the clumsy server who had thrown herself into someone else's disaster, had walked in one night carrying a tray of champagne, and walked out, eventually, carrying something she hadn't known she'd been missing, the particular, irreversible warmth of being exactly where you were supposed to be. I keep thinking about the moment Brynn didn't think. That's the part that stays with me, not the blood, not the ring, not the room full of powerful people, pretending not to notice what was happening right in front of them. It's the moment her body moved before her mind could talk her out of it, because that's what real character looks like, not the version we rehearse in quiet moments when nothing is at stake. The version that shows up when everything is. Brynn had every practical reason to look away. She was a server, invisible by design, underpaid by habit, already carrying more than her share of weight in every sense of the word. She had a mother who needed medication and a brother on her couch and $1,100 between herself and catastrophe. Getting involved in whatever was happening behind that reading room door had no upside for her, none. And she knew it the same way anyone who has spent years navigating rooms where they don't quite belong learns to calculate risk. You keep your head down, you protect what little you have. Stepped in anyway. That's the thing about genuine moral courage. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like the only version of yourself you're willing to be in that moment, regardless of what it costs. And then there's what happened because of it. I don't think Constantin Marot fell for Brynn because she was brave, though she was. I think he recognized something in her that his entire world had been systematically designed to exclude. A person whose first instinct, under real pressure, was to protect someone else. In a life built on loyalty as a transaction, on alliances measured in leverage and mutual threat, he had simply never encountered that before. Not like that. Not from someone who had nothing to gain. That recognition took intelligence. His, yes, but hers too. Because Brynn's clarity about who Marguerite was, what she needed, how to speak to her and move with her and keep her calm without alarming anyone. That wasn't instinct alone. That was paying attention. That was the particular intelligence of someone who has learned to read rooms and people and situations with precision, not because anyone taught her to, but because she had to. Because when you have no margin for error, you get very good at understanding what's actually happening. What I find myself sitting with, weeks after first hearing this story, is the question of perseverance. Not the dramatic kind, the daily kind. The kind that shows up at the start of a double shift when your feet already hurt. The kind that keeps a culinary diploma in a drawer instead of a landfill, because some part of you isn't ready to stop believing it might still mean something. Brynn carried 3 people through years of difficulty without anyone particularly noticing. And she did it without bitterness, without shrinking, without deciding that the world's opinion of her was the final word on her worth. That's the thing that changes outcomes. Not luck, not connections. The decision, made quietly and repeatedly and without applause, to keep showing up as the fullest version of yourself even when the room isn't designed for you. Fontaine had everything the room was designed for, and she used it to diminish people. That's what brought her down. Brynn had none of it, and she used what she had to shield someone. That's what lifted her up. Consequences followed from the choices. They always do.